liberalism was first used in Spain in year 1375. This refers to a group taking up liberal arts in the context of an education desirable for a freeborn man. Words such as liberal, liberty, libertarian, and libertine all trace their history to the Latin word liber. Liber, which means free. Liber referred to a class of freemen who were neither serfs nor slaves. By the year 1840s, liberalism came to be known in Europe as a political idea. Liberal ideas resulted from the breakdown of feudalism in Europe and the growth in its place of a market or capitalism. These ideas were first drawn together and systematized as a distinct ideology by the English philosopher John Locke, generally regarded as the father of modern liberalism.
Liberalism is defined as a political doctrine that takes protecting and enhancing freedom of the individual to be the central problem of politics. It is a defining feature of modern democracy, illustrated by the prevalence of the term liberal democracy as a way to describe countries with free and fair elections, rule of law, and protected civil liberties. It is based on a moral argument that ensuring the right of an individual person to life, liberty, and property is the highest goal of government. Liberals typically believe that government is necessary to protect individuals from being harmed by others, but they also recognize that government itself can pose a threat to liberty. They also typically maintain that humans are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions without asking leave or depending on the will of any other man. According to modern liberalism, the chief task of government is to remove obstacles such as poverty, disease, discrimination, and ignorance that prevent individuals from living freely or from fully realizing their potential. Liberalism has a close but sometimes uneasy relationship with democracy. At the center of democratic doctrine is the belief that governments derive their authority from popular election. Liberalism, on the other hand, is primarily concerned with the scope of governmental activity. Liberals often have been wary of democracy. Then, because of fears that it might generate a tyranny by the majority. One might briskly say, therefore, that democracy looks after majorities and liberalism after unpopular minorities. Liberalism is derived from two related features of Western culture. The first is the West's preoccupation with individuality as compared to the emphasis in other civilizations on status, caste, and tradition. Throughout much of history, the individual has been submerged in and subordinate in his clan, tribe, ethnic group, or kingdom. Liberalism is the culmination of developments in Western society that produce a sense of the importance of human individuality, a liberation of the individual from complete subservience to the group, a relaxation to the tight hold of custom, law, and authority. In this respect, liberalism stands for emancipation of the individual. Liberalism is one of the most central and pervasive political theories and ideologies, yet it is subject to different interpretations as well as misappropriations. Its history carries a crucial heritage of civilized thinking, of political practice, and of philosophical ethical creativity. It is sometimes called a house of many mansions because in order to understand liberalism, you must recognize that there are various ways of looking at it. It is an ideology that contains political concepts that interact at its core, such as liberty, rationality, individuality, progress, sociability, the general interest, and limited and accountable power. These core elements are the nucleus around which all liberalism revolves. Different forms of liberalism were discussed before concluding that liberalism has been adopted by truth seekers, endorsed by humanists, campaigned for by reformers, cast aside by rival ideologies, deliberately misappropriated by those who wish to disguise the real political intentions, and attacked by those who regard it as a self-deluding smokescreen for antisocial conduct. Looking at its historical and theoretical development, we can definitely say that liberalism is one of the most interesting ideologies that ever existed. It is an ideology that believes in value of human personality and spiritual equality of the individual. Liberalism also believes in the autonomy of the individual will. It also believes in goodness of a man and that they are naturally rational. The ideology also believes that a man must possess a natural right for life, liberty, and property. It also believes that state comes into existence by mutual consent for the purpose of protection of rights.
Classical liberalism is the idea that individual freedom and limited government are the best way for humans to form a free society. The classical liberal tradition was born from the great thinkers such as John Locke, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Thomas Jefferson. They all have their own way and their ideas of classical liberalism, but the core belief that the individuals should always be considered above the group always remained constant. Jefferson even threw in the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence to drive home the point that your happiness wasn't the government's to give, but rather yours to take. Putting the individual above the group not only empowers you to live your life as you see fit, but it also neutralizes the forces of racism and bigotry which judge people not on their individuality but on the group characteristics, be it color of skin, gender, or sexuality. These days, liberalism has been confused with leftism or progressivism, which actually has nothing to do with classical liberalism. Sadly, the left is no longer liberal at all, for it's traded in individualism for collectivism. So it doesn't matter if you're a liberal, a conservative, or an independent. It doesn't matter if you're a Christian or an atheist, black or white, man or woman. What matters is whether you wish to live your life as a free person in a free society based on your own ideas and actions.
Modern liberalism. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the negative effects of the concept of classical liberalism finally began to show up in North America and Europe. Great masses of people failed to benefit from the wealth flowing from factories and lived in poverty in vast slums. The production of goods was rapidly increasing because of capitalism, but the purchasing power of the people remained the same. Hence, there was a Great Depression in the US and Europe. The liberals recognized hindrances of another kind, such as poverty, disease, discrimination, and ignorance, which individuals could overcome only with the positive assistance of government. So, to achieve a more just distribution of wealth and income, the liberalists promoted the organization of workers into trade unions in order to improve their power to bargain with their employers. Society, acting through government, establish public schools and hospitals, aid the needy, and regulate working conditions to promote workers' health and well-being. Because only through public support the poor and powerless members of society could truly become free.
The 3 decades of unprecedented general prosperity that the Western world experienced after World War II marked the high tide of modern liberalism. But the slowing of economic growth that gripped most Western countries beginning in the mid-1970s presented a serious challenge to modern liberalism. By the end of that decade, economic stagnation combined with the cost of maintaining the social benefits of the welfare state pushed governments increasingly toward politically untenable levels of taxation and mounting debt. But the result too often was increased inflation and ever smaller declines in unemployment rates. As modern liberals struggled to meet the challenges of stagnating living standards in mature industrial economies, others saw an opportunity for a revival of classical liberalism. The intellectual foundation of this revival were primarily the work of Austrian-born British economist Friedrich von Hayek and the American economist Milton Friedman. One of Hayek's greatest achievements was to demonstrate on purely logical grounds that a centrally planned economy is impossible. He also argued that interventionist measures aimed at the redistribution of wealth led inevitably to totalitarianism. Friedman held that the business cycle is determined mainly by the supply of money and by interest rate rather than by government fiscal policy. These arguments were enthusiastically embraced by the major conservative political parties in Britain and the United States, which had never abandoned the classical liberal conviction that the market, for all its fault, guides economic policy better than governments do. Liberals have always invoked the concept of rights to argue against tyranny and oppression, but in the later 20th century, claims to rights became the most common way of articulating struggles for social justice. The prototypical mass movement in this regard was the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1950s and 60s, which resulted in legislation forbidding most forms of discrimination against a large African American minority and which fundamentally altered the climate of race relations in the United States. In the 1970s, there arose similar movements struggling for equal rights for women, gays and lesbians, the physically or mentally disabled, and other minorities or disadvantaged social groups. Thus, liberalism historically has sought to foster a plurality of different ways of life or different conceptions of the good life by protecting the rights and interests of first the middle class and religious minorities, then the working class and the poor, and finally racial minorities, women's, gays, and lesbians, and the physically or mentally disabled.
African liberalism. Liberalism is meant to be about freedom for all individuals regardless of race, but linking liberalism to whiteness as it is happening now is not new in South Africa. The Liberal Party in South Africa demands to the government a constitution which would contain a Bill of Rights, making education available for all, freedom of association whether in political or trade union. Perhaps it was its non-racial policy that gave oppressed people a voice of defiance that irked the apartheid government. Apartheid means a policy of racial segregation and political and economic discrimination against non-European groups in Republic of South Africa. The government responded to the LPSA and its policies by persecuting its members as it viewed the party's policies as a threat to its apartheid policy. Several members of the party were banned, disallowed to hold gatherings, and harassed by the security police. Also, leaders and those who worked for LPSA lost their job and were forced to resign from the party as they could no longer freely associate with their comrades in carrying out party work. Their personal freedom was also restricted. In addition to the banning and harassment of its members, the government began issuing notices restricting certain racial groups from joining those political parties. After some time, the Progressive Party, an extension of the franchise, decided not to disband but become a whites-only party, while the LPSA chose to disband rather than comply with legislation that went against its defining principle of non-racialism. The Progressive Party later on became the Democratic Alliance. After the 1999 general election, when it ran a campaign urging voters to fight back against the governing African National Congress, it picked support from African-speaking whites and those members of racial minorities who feared the ANC. Some years later, it began a campaign to recruit Black African memberships, which was reasonably successful. The white liberals were shocked when Black DA parliamentarians supported forms of race-based affirmative action, which the white liberals tend to oppose on the grounds that it violates the principle that jobs should be allocated by merit. The claim that merit means choosing whites and that Black incumbents always lack merit is a deeply rooted prejudice among many white South Africans. American liberalism. In American liberalism, they believe that the duty of the government is to protect the natural rights of the people, which includes the liberty, life, and pursuit of happiness. As with any political philosophy, there are different strands of liberalism present. However, the term liberal generally applies to those people who subscribe to the ideals of modern liberalism. The core of modern liberal belief in the United States is the protection of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, association, and religion. They also believe in the separation of church and state, equality under the law, and the right to due process. Much of this is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. Liberalism in America has been a party of social progress rather than of intellectual doctrine, committed to ends rather than to methods. The liberal believes that social change can better the quality of people's life and happiness. Liberals also believe that moderate government intervention is needed in order to assure more equal opportunities for everyone.
The triumphal narrative of liberal democratic capitalism was disrupted by the rise of capitalism in East Asia, whose political leaders regularly espouse anti- or non-liberal social values way before its current disruption by rising xenophobic and neo-nationalist right-wing politics in liberal democratic Europe and America itself. Undoubtedly, rapid industrialization and urbanization under global capitalism have loosened social constraints on individuals in East Asia. However, it would be grossly simplistic to equate market-driven money-making opportunities and consumer sovereignty as the totalizing values of contemporary East Asia. Indeed, even the technocratic state planners can be found actively reinventing and formalizing local history, cultural values, and practices into different counter-discourses to economic liberalism as to project a different future society. This is symptomatic of the shallow roots of economic liberal individualism in Asia. With the exception of Japan, all nation-states in Asia are post-Second World War minted post-colonial states, even never formerly colonized China and Thai kingdom, were forced to grant extraterritoriality to foreign powers of Europe, America, and Japan. The idea of democracy and its attendant practices are therefore very appealing for these post-war, post-colonial nations. Different political developments of the different nations of different Asian nations after Second World War would be, with the exception of the communist states in China, North Korea, and Vietnam, all East Asian nations have attempted to institutionalize electoral democracy upon political independence. However, most attempts failed quickly, bringing in trained military-backed authoritarian regimes. Soft authoritarian regimes or hard authoritarian regimes remain in place in Southeast Asia. Since the 1980s, South Korea, Taiwan, and Indonesia have completed transition from military-backed authoritarian regimes to fully elected government with peaceful changes of ruling party, but they have not entirely shaken off corruption and nepotism. Overall, one can conclude that all the non-communist countries in East Asia have progressively institutionalized periodic elections of political office holders, although corruption, violence, and other forms of tampering within the electoral process continue in several countries. However, ideologically political liberalism is often explicitly rejected in almost all instances for three identifiable reasons. First, the historical specificities of decolonization and new state formation often stand in the way of democratic government. In many cases, military and political leaders who led the armed decolonization struggle often retains the power to govern. Most of them often think that having shed blood for the birth of new nation automatically have the legitimate right to lead the new nation. Second, the new East Asian states are still very much insecure objects in the making, which continue to tightly embrace their citizens without a bounded national space and inscribing upon them a national identity as part of the nation-building process. Nationalism remains a vital social political force that effectively holds on the respective peoples. Under such circumstances, liberalism's ideological injunction for a minimalist state would be anathema to national unity, which the new nations are struggling to establish and maintain. Finally, the West, whom the ideology of liberalism originated, is still remembered as ex-colonizers. Their political criticism on the absence of liberal democracy are routinely resisted and countered with particularistic local histories and cultural traditions, and that the speed and shape of democratic development should be debated and decided by the local citizen and is no business of the past imperialist. In summary, almost all Asian nations have explicitly rejected the theology of liberal democratic capitalism as the universal and ultimate fate of all nations. Classical liberalism, or simply liberalism, is the signature political philosophy of Western civilization. Hints and suggestions of the liberal idea can be found in other great cultures, but it was the distinctive society produced in Europe that served as the seedbed of liberalism. In turn, that society was decisively shaped by the liberal movement. The centralization and the division of power have been the hallmarks of the history of Europe. After the fall of Rome, no empire was ever able to dominate the continent. Instead, Europe became a complex mosaic of competing nations, principalities, and city-states. The various rulers found themselves in a competition with each other. The kings also found powerful rivals in ambitious and religious authorities who were backed by the international church. By the Middle Ages, many parts of Europe, especially in the West, had developed a culture friendly to property rights and trades. As the modern age began, rulers started to shake free of age-old customary constraints on their power. Royal absolutism became the main tendency of the time. The kings of Europe raised a novel claim. They declared that they were appointed by God to be the fountainhead of all life and activity in society. Accordingly, they sought to direct religion, culture, politics, and especially the economic life of the people. To support their bureaucracies and constant wars, the rulers required ever-increasing quantities of taxes, which they tried to squeeze out of their subjects in ways that they were contrary to precedent and customs. The first people to revolt against this system were the Dutch. After a struggle that lasted 4 decades, they won their independence from Spain and proceeded to set up a unique polity, the United Provinces. As the radically decentralized state was called, had no king and little power at the federal level. Making money was the passion of these busy manufacturers and traders. They had no time for hunting heretics or suppressing new ideas. Thus, de facto religious toleration and a wide-ranging freedom of press came to prevail. Devoted to industry and trade, the Dutch established a legal system based solidly on the rule of law and the sanctity of property and contract. Taxes were low and everyone worked. The Dutch economic miracle was the wonder of age. Thoughtful observers throughout Europe noted the Dutch success with great interest. With the king gone, a group of middle-class radicals emerged called the Levelers. They protested that not even Parliament had any authority to usurp the natural, God-given rights of the people. Religion, they declared, was a matter of individual conscience. It should have no connection with the state. State-granted monopolies were likewise an infringement of natural liberty. A generation later, John Locke set forth a powerful liberal model of man, society, and state. Every man, he said, is innately endowed with certain natural rights. This consists in his fundamental right to what is his property, his life, liberty, and estates or material goods. Government is formed simply the better to preserve the right to property. The society that emerged in England after the victory over absolutism began to score astonishing success in economic and cultural life. With the help of the philosophers and people who fought for one's own freedom, liberalism in Europe flourished. The new society formed on the philosophy of natural rights in Europe served as the best example of liberalism that was spread all over the world. Currently, liberalism in Europe serves as a political movement that supports a broad tradition of individual liberties and constitutionally limited and democratically accountable government. These European derivatives of classical liberalism are found in centrist movements and parties, as well as some parties on the center-right and the center-left. Liberalism in Europe has a different meaning from the signification it has in contemporary politics in the US. In America, liberals might be confused with leftists which advocate for a larger government, some forms of protectionism and more economic interventionism, whereas European liberals usually favor limited government, free trade, and adhere to economic liberalism.
Oceania. Liberalism in Oceania dates back to the earliest pioneers of the area and has maintained a strong foothold up until now. One notable pioneer is Sir Robert Menzies. He played a central role in the creation of the Liberal Party in Australia, defining its policies and its broad outreach. He said, as quoted, "We choose the word liberal because we want to be progressive, in no way conservative, in no way reactionary."
Menzies, to me, is by far the dominant figure of Australian liberal thinking in the 20th century. He was a man of phenomenal intellect who had a clear view of the role of government as being there to liberate an individual's potential. His Forgotten People speeches of the 1940s set about defining people that were left out. They weren't served by big business or served by unions, and ultimately they were oppressed by government. He sought to stand up for them. Those ideas are as relevant today as they were then.
It's critically important in any organisation to not ever lose sight of that in which you believe. And for us as Liberals, in forging policy with different horizons and a different future faced from that of Sir Robert Menzies, that we go back and never lose sight of the fundamentals. Those fundamentals being the belief in reaching out to people in all parts of Australian society, people that believe that they don't have a voice, who wonder how they can be heard. It's also important to reward families, small businesses, to make sure that people have incentives and rewards to get out of bed and take a risk and work hard to build a better Australia for themselves and their families